You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Yes, indeed. Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. Glad to have you guys back with me again as we begin this reading of a new paper tonight. I see in the chat room, I already have Kevin Care 42 and NYC Beauties. You guys follow NYC Beauties on YouTube. Beautiful photography, beautiful Black women. Check it out. Make sure to like and subscribe and comment on what you see. All right. Before we begin, let me just remind you guys that this show is part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. There are other shows on the network I feel you should be checking out. For example,
this is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
you should also be checking out the Queen's Council. Check out the Queen's Council podcast, also on KWAZ Radio. So make sure you guys check those out. Tune into those shows. Great shows. Great Sunday show recently by the pro-Black perspective. On the Sunday worship, good stuff, and you know how it goes. The Harsh Reality Podcast is always bringing that insight on the latest news that's going down, so you guys should check them out, right? Also, as a reminder and as a item of interest for those of you who might be new here tonight or new to listening to this podcast. We have a Bitter Medicine Podcast Discord server that we're trying to build. We're trying to get more people involved. Definitely, if you're interested, if you like what you hear here, and you want to join the Discord server as a fan of the podcast, that's great. But we also have a project that we work on. It's an African-centered curriculum. I'll probably talk about it tonight as well. If you want to be involved, man, by all means, hop on the server, introduce yourself, and ask how can you help. All right. Is everyone out there able to hear me pretty well? Am I coming through pretty well? Just want to make sure that I'm sounding well on the broadcast. All right. So how's everyone doing? You're live with me right now. Just let me know how you're doing. All right, I'm curious to know how everyone is. It doesn't have to always be about me and reading a paper or the podcast. How are you guys doing? That's what I want to know. You guys put your comments down in the chat. So let's get to it. So, again, the podcast has the project of creating a new African-centered curriculum. One that's not general, one that hits exactly at the heart of what we need. We need our children, we need our people to pass through a rite of passage, pass through an educational paradigm or program where we know how to solve our own problem. We're all Africans. We know that we need a strong Africa, right, to protect its people, right? We need Africa to be a world power. And you know, I recently talked about the African American, the African Caribbean, the African from the continent. One of the things about that conversation that we need to make clear too, we would have less defectors, right? Folks who, instead of claiming African, you want to be, you know, Native American, this, that, and the other. We would have less defectors when we have more power. Power brings people together, right? Power brings people together. And so if you want to get rid of all these defectors and these people talking about ADOS and FBA and all this old foolishness, have a stronger Africa, have something that people can be proud of, and not just something of the past, but something of the living present. And that's what we need to work towards. And so the problems that Africa has, we need to be teaching our people how to solve problems. There was a time when we knew how to solve problems and we solved our own problems. And after we had contact with Europeans, right, after we were colonized by Europeans, right, now we're in this place, this weird place where we're always looking to them for help. And one of the people who had, you know, this great idea about how to pull the race up, how to pull our people up, was Booker T. Washington. His Tuskegee model, or the Tuskegee Institute, that he created back in like 1905, right, is actually it was 1881, right, is the model that we need to start to pursue. It was a model that taught students how to fix the environment around them. You go to church and there's a leaky roof, well, come at this school, you learn how to fix a leaky roof. Not only that, you learn how to, you know, do the things that are associated with fixing a roof. You learn the accounting, for example, right? The prep, for example, right? You'll understand how much you're worth based on the kind of work that you can complete from start to finish, right? And so we got to start pushing that type of education. So if you're into what I'm talking about, come and help us build this curriculum. The reason why you need hands to build a curriculum, and the reason why we see so much curricula out there that falls short, that's general, that's vague, is because if you leave it to one or two people to do that work, they're going to be general and vague. It's too much. What's required requires hands, requires people. Right? It's too much for one or two people to do that work. You want a curriculum that can demonstrate and also convince that the adherents of the curriculum are gonna be able to do what the curriculum states it's setting you up for, which was building your community, connecting you to your African tradition, right? And towards power. Power would be for black folks in America, I don't care where you're from, to be able to send a team down or teams down to Flint, Michigan and fix the water crisis that's been going on for at least 5-6 years now. Right? As we see in the chat room, Kevin Care42 says self-sufficiency in the black world is the only way to go. We have to look inwards, not outwards. A team, each person has their own responsibility, and that's what we're talking about. Anything we do going forward, we have to be working in teams. So come and join your hands, your thoughts, your feet, your heart, your mind to the project that we're working on. Jump on the Discord server today. The link is in the chat room. All right. So let's get into this reading. The Tuskegee Model of Development in Africa. another dimension of the African-American connection. This paper is by Michael O. West. And then here we go. For most people, the word Tuskegee brings to mind the image of Booker T. Washington and the policy of industrial education that the Tuskegee Institute, which he founded in 1881, has been associated with from the outset. In his seminal 2-volume biography of Washington, however, Lewis R. Harlan points out that industrial education was far from being central to the overall philosophy of Washington and his so-called Tuskegee machine. Indeed, the notion of industrial education for African-American youth was not original with Washington, or for that matter, his mentor, General S.C. Armstrong of Hampton Institute. Rather, it had been an integral part of Black nationalist thought since the antebellum period. All right, that's good to know. The two leading Black intellectuals of the 19th century, Edward R. Blyden and Alexander Crummell, both supported industrial education. Washington's unique contribution to that concept is to be found in the association he made between industrial education and Black acquiescence to Southern Jim Crow, in his ability to convince Northern capitalists to underwrite this compromise. The term Tuskegee Model of Development thus refers not only to industrial education, but also to the general policy of Black development associated with Washington and his institute, namely submission to duly constituted authority, Black capitalism, self-help schemes, race pride, and character building, as well as industrial education. And I'm for everything. That's nothing but a word right there. I'm for everything that was listed right there. All right? Self-help schemes, Black capitalism, race pride, character building. We really need character building. You guys, if you haven't already, go and look up Booker T. Washington's book on character. Great read. A lot of like lessons you could pass on to children, especially. Great read. The story of the attempt to export the Tuskegee model of development to Africa bears upon the Black experience in the United States in two ways. First, although that story is not usually studied in the context of Pan-Africanism, it sheds considerable light on a much neglected aspect of the history, or at any rate, the historiography of Pan-Africanism, particularly between 1890s and the 1930s. Second, and more important for our purposes, the Tuskegee model's impact on Africa brings into sharp relief the African-American role in the export of American economic, cultural, and political influence. In this instance, the export of a social system deemed particularly suited for people of African descent. The attempt in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to export the Tuskegee model to Africa was in a sense part of a wider wave of African-American encounters with Africa that began with the opening decades of the 19th century. In 1816, for instance, Paul Cuffey, a free Black sailor and entrepreneur, took to Africa at his own expense 38 African-American immigrants. Cuffey also attempted to develop, over a century before Marcus Garvey came along with the idea for the Black Star Line, regular commercial relations between the United States and West Africa. And you know, right there's an example of something that we do a lot. You know, it happens through whatever means that someone gets a bigger name and they become associated with things, not recognizing that someone came before oftentimes and did it or spoke about it before, right? So Paul Cuffey is someone we should be thinking about, right? Paul Cuffey is someone we should be giving some props to as well, because he had this idea, you know, for a star line type thing before Garvey did. It's similar to, say, Malcolm X saying "Buy Black" when Carlos Cook said it before him. But Malcolm X is clearly the bigger name, right? Similarly, African-American missionary societies were among the first American religious groups to enter the African field beginning with the arrival in West Africa in 1821 of two Baptist ministers, Lot Carey and Colin Teague. Sorry, I had to take a drink of water. Indeed, as St. Clair Drake argued in an influential booklet, much of 19th century Black American religious thought centered on the idea of African redemption. Many African Americans believed that Providence, while not condoning the nefarious trade in human cargoes, had allowed Africans to be taken from their homeland and brought up as slaves to the Americas, where they will convert to Christianity and subsequently return home to evangelize the continent. Bullshit, but okay. This argument found its highest expression in the writings of Edward Blyden, who also maintained, in Augustinian fashion, that the Islamization of West Africa, involving as it did the imposition of a certain cultural and linguistic unity over the subcontinent, was merely a prelude to the eventual triumph of Christianity. If Blyden was around today, do you think he would be so hard set on Christianity being the triumphant end, right? Like the final form or the final stage of Africa? In the chat room, Kevin Care 42 says, we need a unifying force for the black world. Cannot be religion, true. Sexual preference, true, etc. As you said, black pride. That will be the foundation. It goes on to say, then we build an economic base, then political. With these, power. With these come power. Yeah, everything is about power. And that's the bottom line. Everything is about power. If you go to college, for example, right, and you have to go to these, what they call them again, PWIs or whatever, you have to go to these white institutions. Whatever you major in should be something that's useful in building power for your people. Do you understand? It has to be something useful in building power for your people. Now, by the way, that doesn't, in fact, let me change the way I was going to say that. Don't think that we're only talking about, well, you got to go to school and learn science, and you got to go and learn architecture and all of this stuff. No. Like Kevin Care 42 in the chat room, we need the photographers. We need the photographers who are fully immersed, right? Who are connected to their culture, the community, to show images of our people in I guess in a bright light, you know, part of that positive propaganda type stuff, right? We need to show them in their realest and rawest form so that we get some, you know, some connectivity to our folks. We need the writers, we need the poets, we need the musicians, we need all of it. But whatever it is you're doing, bottom line, it's supposed to be going towards a power structure that you're building for your people, preferably on the continent of Africa. To continue, while excluded more thoroughly than ever from the mainstream of American life following the overthrow of Reconstruction, African Americans in the late 19th century continued to participate in the overseas expansion of American influence, especially in Africa. Of singular interest in this connection is John Waller, the American consul in Madagascar from 1891 to 1894. A lawyer, newspaperman, and politician from Topeka, Kansas, Waller had been rewarded with the Madagascan consulship for helping to deliver Kansas for Benjamin Harrison's victorious Republican ticket in 1888. During his nearly 4 years at this minor diplomatic post, Waller, whose thoughts on Negro colonization paralleled the history of American expansionism in the 19th century, spent a great deal of time attempting to obtain land for the establishment of a Black American colony. Quote, an enterprise which he believed would inevitably benefit his race, his country, his party, and himself. All right? John Waller. People we need to know, people we need to teach about in history. right? Like virtually all such schemes during this period, Wallace's colonization plans ran directly counter to European imperialist ambitions in Africa. The French, who were then stepping up their campaign to impose colonial rule on Madagascar, moved decisively to thwart his plans. In 1895, they arrested Waller, who had remained on the island to pursue his colonization scheme after being relieved of his diplomatic assignment on charges of spying for the beleaguered Hoover monarchy. It was only after the Democratic administration of Grover Cleveland, which had replaced Waller with a Southern white, threatened to sever diplomatic relationship with France, that the erstwhile diplomat was released. This was not the end of Waller's colonization schemes, however. He subsequently attempted again unsuccessfully to found an African-American settlement in Cuba. You see, as we've said on the show, and as we've heard others say in the past, land is freedom. And that's the truth of the matter. Sorry. Land is freedom. And that's why you gotta think in abundance. You gotta think about acquiring land, and to do that, you need resources to get land, etc., etc. But there's an approach that can be made, right? A collective, a group approach that can be made to acquire this land. You see, what happened here with Waller is that, based on this, summary of the events, he was pretty much. It seems he was pretty much by himself in this endeavor. This is what organizations need to be doing, right? This is what organizations need to be doing. Collecting funds, just like how churches have the church building fund. Have an organization that has the land accumulation fund, right? You gotta do it. In large measure, Waller's colonization activities have sparked historical curiosity because of the vigorous manner in which he went about trying to realize them while in the diplomatic service of the United States. Such activities were neither unique nor original, however. Waller was building on a black colonization and immigration tradition that went back to the era of American Revolution. This tradition, which had waned in the optimistic climate of Reconstruction, was reinvigorated in the age of Jim Crow. In fact, Waller's Madagascar project was just one of many, mostly abortive, black colonization schemes that were floated in the 19th and early 20th centuries. See, this is why I like reading about stuff like this. All right? When you read these papers, they connect you to various areas of thought, various areas of history, various areas of research, etc. And so now we know what Waller tried to do in Madagascar. We see what one of the big failures, or I should say reasons for failure, was the French got involved. And while you might not have the heavy presence of the colonizers on the continent, I mean, they still have a presence, no doubt. If you join the Discord and you go to the Off Topics channel, you'll read this post that talks about how France still has a heavy hand in Africa. In fact, without Africa, France would be lower than Haiti, economically, right? But we know that the Europeans got involved, and that's the thing. If you have to move in a certain way. If you move thinking that you're just gonna do it and nothing will happen, or there won't be any disruption, you're playing yourself. You have to realize and make up your mind that there'll be saboteurs. There'll be people who wanna come in and try end the endeavor. And so you have to be able to protect against that as well. Remember, with power there's protection. You have to have protection if you're in a power position. You see what I'm saying? In the chat room, Kevin K42 says, long before power was used as a sword, it is used as a shield, Professor Black Truth. That's why when you become wealthy, you have to level up the trusted people around you. You build protection, exactly. The king and queen are nothing without their diplomats, spiritual guides, and most important, military. That's absolutely correct. Kevin K is on it. Kevin K is on it. It's absolutely correct. To continue, the Tuskegee Model of Development differed from this established tradition of African-American interaction in several important respects. It disavowed colonization, and it was endorsed and promoted by various white agencies of imperialism, both American and European. And unlike the earlier phase of Pan-African interconnection, with few exceptions, continental Africans were involved in development projects only as passive subjects. The Tuskegee model attracted the support of members of the emergent Christian educated African elite, a number of whom helped to propagate it among the masses. The Tuskegee model was introduced into Africa through Booker T. Washington's writings and activities, right? So if you haven't realized yet, the new African-centered curriculum that is a part of that is our project, that is the project of the Bitter Medicine Podcast, is built on the idea of the Tuskegee model. But we need to update it for this present time, and we need to have it focused on the two things that I always talk about, right? So, solution production and power, right? Which in itself is the ability to solve your own problems, right? So that's why Booker T. Washington comes up often in our talks, because that's the model that clearly has the direction to it that we want to go. But of course, the Tuskegee model was over 100 years ago. We need to update it, and we need to flesh it out so that we really get people, once they've passed through it, who are our problem solvers, who will be our patriotic leaders in the future, etc., etc. To continue, in the 2 decades between his famous speech at the Atlanta Exposition of 1895, which catapulted him to fame, and his death in 1915, Washington was far and away the most prominent and influential black figure on the world stage. Soon after its publication in 1901, his autobiography, Up From Slavery, which is in the Discord, I believe, or about to be in the Discord, you guys should check that out, was translated into all of the major European languages used in Africa, as well as into a number of indigenous African languages, and many of the missionary societies that operated schools in colonial Africa made it required reading for their students. Think about that. Right? Think about that. How many of you listening have read the book Up From Slavery? This book, in addition to narrating the story of Washington's personal upward social mobility from slavery, profiled the development of the Tuskegee Institute. Although historians often portray Washington as a Southern provincial, he was very much involved in African affairs. And see, that's the thing I learned in the last couple of months in doing this podcast and talking about Booker T. Washington more and more as we discuss the need for African-centered education. I always thought he was kind of anti-African, but I learned differently. To continue, he corresponded with numerous Africans, enrolled African students at Tuskegee, and supported the development of industrial education in Africa. He promoted the Tuskegee model by dispatching teams of Tuskegee graduates to Togo, then a German colony, and the Sudan, to introduce cotton growing schemes. In 1904, he became vice president of the Congo Reform Association, an organization working to bring political reform to the Congo Free State, in the wake of the scandal surrounding publication of the brutal exploitation of Africans in that colony, present-day Zaire. If you go back a couple of months ago, I read a paper that was talking about Booker T. Washington's work in Togo, right? Predictably, Washington's influence in African affairs was most pronounced in Liberia. In 1910, he prevailed upon the American government to dispatch a warship to help the Americo-Liberian authorities put down a rebellion by the indigenous population. In 1912, he played a major role in helping the United States secure an international loan for the Black Republic. Liberia paid a very high price for this assistance, however. As a condition for obtaining the loan, the United States and its partners demanded that Liberia cede control of its customs office, which was the most important financial agency in the country. That's interesting. Liberia thus effectively abandoned whatever claims it had to national sovereignty. The Americo-Liberian elite had reasons to be grateful for Washington's intervention. However, and in 1929, in what was described as the greatest educational event in the history of the country, the Liberian head of state presided over ceremonies establishing the Booker Washington Agricultural and Industrial Institute, itself the product of white American philanthropy and Tuskegee technical expertise. Washington also played an important role in planning and publicizing the first Pan-African Congress of 1900. In 1898, Sylvester Williams, the secretary of the London-based African Association, which sponsored the Congress, had written to Washington inviting him to join the year-old organization. Washington seemed not to have responded to this invitation, but less than a year later, Williams wrote again to inform him of the upcoming gathering, explaining that the organizers of the Congress were, quote, anxious of discussing the lynching question from the Afro-American standpoint. He invited Washington, quote, as the leader of an important association in the States, to send a representative over. If not, we shall be pleased to welcome you. Washington also was asked to publicize the Congress as widely as possible, a request to which he responded with great enthusiasm. Writing some 5 weeks later to the editor of the Indianapolis Freeman from London, where he attended a planning session of the Congress, Washington lauded this, quote, very important movement that has just been put afoot, offering the view that it's going to be one of the most effective and far-reaching gatherings that has ever been held in connection with the development of the race. He advised as many of our people as can possibly do so to attend this conference. Washington, who had been invited to present a paper on industrial development, failed to attend the Congress itself, apparently because too many of his enemies, including W.E.B. Du Bois, whose name later became synonymous with Pan-Africanism, were in attendance. 12 years after this meeting, Washington sponsored his own Pan-African gathering. 12 years after this meeting, Washington sponsored his own Pan-African gathering, called the International Conference on the Negro. It was, as Washington explained, organized in response to, quote, letters from missionaries in foreign fields, letters from government officials, especially in Europe, asking for some information that would put them in touch with the methods of education employed here at Tuskegee. End of quote. The principal objective of the assembly, therefore, was to afford an opportunity for studying the methods employed in helping the Negro people of the United States, with a view of deciding to what extent Tuskegee and Hampton methods may be applied to conditions in these countries, like of the Caribbean and Latin America, as well as to conditions in Africa. The conference, which was held at Tuskegee from 17 to 19 April 1912, brought together 120 black and white religious and secular experts and specialists on the Negro question. The delegates, who represented 21 countries and colonies, came from the sections of the world where the Negro is most thickly settled and where the race question is more or less acute. As might have been expected, the conference lived up to Washington's expectations. The delegates strongly endorsed industrial training as the preferred form of education for blacks everywhere, and generally applauded the Tuskegee Model of Development as being relevant throughout the black world. Right? Relevant throughout the black world, because we need to build. Tuskegee Institute, the final declaration, boldly asserted, had, quote, become a great experimental station in racial education and a center of Negro life. A committee consisting of Washington and 3 other delegates, with 3 more to be appointed later, was formed to arrange the next conference, scheduled for 1915. Washington died before that conference could take place, however, and the International Conference on the Negro Movement, which had the potential to develop in a pro-colonial rival of Du Bois's Pan-African Congress and of Garveyism, died with him. What did, if you're in the chat room and you can, just post this for me. How did Washington die? Was it a sickness like yellow fever or something like that? How did Booker T. Washington die? Robert R. Moton, Washington's successor as president of the Tuskegee Institute, maintained Tuskegee's policy with regard to industrial education, especially in Liberia, but he had not seemed to share his predecessor's broader political ambitions and could not take Washington's place at the helm of the International Conference on the Negro. More the conciliator than the antagonist, Moton strive, quote, with typical even-handedness and characteristic evasiveness, end of quote, to maintain working, if not exactly cordial relationships with virtually all of the major movements and leaders in the black world during his tenure as president of Tuskegee. Continental Africans, several of whom attended the International Conference on the Negro, also played a part in introducing the Tuskegee Model of Development into Africa. The African exponents of the Tuskegee Model included a number of traditional rulers who had been incorporated into the colonial administration under the British system of indirect rule, especially in Southern Africa. These individuals generally were advised by members of the educated African elite or by white, that is, European or American missionaries, though there was the occasional black American who also acted in this capacity. For example, Conrad A. Rideout, a missionary with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church, became an emissary for a number of African chiefs in various parts of Southern Africa. Southern Africa at the turn of the century. Rideout was especially active in attempting to persuade the British colonial officials to back the establishment of industrial schools in the chiefdoms. The most effective African exponents of the Tuskegee model, however, were individuals who had gone to school in the United States and who consequently had some direct experience with Washington and his institute, even if they were never actually enrolled in. 2 of these individuals stand out: John L. Dewey of South Africa and James E. K. Gray of the Gold Coast. I read about these guys in a previous paper. Again, the paper where I talk about Booker T in Togo will shed light on them some more. In the chat room, Kevin Care 42 is coming through. He says Booker T died of complications from hypertension. Wow. He posted a link below. You guys could check out the link. Wow. Complication of hypertension. Ain't that something? A native of South Africa's Zulu-dominated Natal province, Dube established in 1901 a Tuskegee-type industrial school, thus earning himself the title of, quote, the Booker T. Washington of South Africa. Though educated at the eminently literary Oberlin College, Dube became keenly interested in industrial education, to which he had been exposed even before going to the United States. forced by failing health to return home after spending 5 years at Oberlin, Dubé, in anticipation of opening his own industrial institute, returned to the United States in the late 1890s to raise funds and observe firsthand the workings of the Hampton and Tuskegee models. In a speech delivered before Hampton's 1897 graduating class, Dubé declared that, quote, "The greatest need of my people is industrial education," and he appealed to the African-American graduates to join him in his work. Not a proponent of the view that all Negroes should go to Africa, Dubé nevertheless urged the new captains of industry, as Washington was fond of calling Tuskegee graduates, to go to Africa and teach as you are taught in Hampton. Think what two such schools at Hampton and Tuskegee would do for our people. Demonstrating a tremendous mastery of the religious rhetorical style that would have been so familiar to his African-American audience, Dubé concluded his speech with a strong display of biblical imagery. Quote, "If you never hear me again, I appeal to you tonight for Africa, that dark continent. I long for the day when the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in his wings, and when on every hilltop shall be a schoolhouse and a church. Then shall we say to Africa, arise and shine, for thy light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon thee. May the sons and daughters of Hampton have a part in bringing about this great day. I pray that some of you may come and help me in my work." Only a handful of New World blacks answered Dubé's call, however. Chief among them was Reynolds Scott, a West Indian whom Dubé had met in the United States. Nevertheless, throughout his career as an industrial educator, Dubé maintained close contact with the American industrial education movement, especially with Washington and Tuskegee, making several fundraising trips to the United States. Some of Dubé's major American financial contributors, such as his American Committee, which consisted of a number of individual philanthropists, and the Phelps-Stokes Fund, were also keen backers of the Tuskegee Institute. Tuskegee also influenced Dubé's political outlook. When he became president of the newly created South African Native National Congress, now the African National Congress, in 1912, he cited Washington as his ideological and political mentor in his inaugural address. "You have asked me, quote, you have asked me to lead, and perchance you would ask me now how I intend to do so. I will show you my frame of mind and my ideal in 2 words. I take for my motto, and I hope as faithful and dutiful followers it will be yours also, festina lente, hasten, slowly. And for my patron saint, I select that great and edifying man, Booker Washington. I've chosen the great man firstly because he is perhaps the most famous and best living example of our African sons. And secondly, because like him, I too have my heart centered mainly on the education of my race. I too have my heart centered mainly on the education of my race. Therein, methinks, lies the shortest and best way to their mental, moral, material, social, and political betterment." Right? That's how you do it. Finally, Dubé was also influenced by Washington's economic philosophy. In 1932, he helped to found and become the president of the Bantu Business League, modeled on Washington's National Negro Business League. The principal objective of the Bantu Business League was to promote business enterprises among Bantu or African people in the South. In the chat room, I see there's some activity. Kevin Kerr, referring to Booker T having died from complications from hypertension, says he was stressed. As you said earlier in the program, one person cannot do it themselves. They need a team. Look at Lenin and Stalin. They both had strokes. Team equals success. KW Dawn 7. Shout out to KW Dawn 7. Man, talk about a long time regular. KW Dawn 7 is here. He says Booker T was murdered. He was bludgeoned in New York City. He survived long enough to die at home. Wow, is that right? Hold on. I don't remember. I don't remember this at all. He was, wow. Let me quickly take a quick peek and see what I find. Let me take a quick peek and see what I find here. Because that's two different directions, right? So I'm just going to do a quick Wikipedia read. It says that despite his extensive travels and widespread work, Washington continued as principal of Tuskegee. Washington's health was deteriorating rapidly in 1915. He collapsed in New York City and was diagnosed by two different doctors having Bright's disease, related to kidney disease. Told he only had a few days left to live, Washington expressed a desire to die at Tuskegee. He boarded a train and arrived in Tuskegee shortly after midnight on November 14, 1915. You know, as I'm reading this, I now remember there was talk that he was beaten to death and killed. Actually, I do kind of remember what KW Dawn 7 is saying. Because the official story was he died from some disease, right? But I do remember the word was he was actually murdered, and I think a woman was the one to report that he had actually beaten to death and murdered. Anyway, Wikipedia says he boarded a train and arrived in Tuskegee shortly after midnight on November 14, 1915. He died a few hours later at the age of 59. His funeral was held on November 17, 1915 in the Tuskegee Institute Chapel, and it was attended by nearly 8,000 people. He was buried nearby in the Tuskegee University campus cemetery. At the time, he was thought to have died by congestive heart failure, aggravated by overwork. In March 2006, his descendants permitted examination of medical records. These showed he had hypertension with a blood pressure more than twice normal, confirming what had long been suspected. At Washington's death, Tuskegee's endowment was close to $2 million. Washington's greatest life work, the education of blacks in the South, was well underway and expanding. Yeah, okay. Yeah, but as I said, I think two things were said. He died from hypertension, and I do remember it was said somewhere that he was probably beaten to death. I do remember that, and I see that KW Dawn 7 and Kevin Care 42 have posted some new links in there, I guess, supporting their original, their original statement as to how he died. Yeah, that's the thing about memory. You start to forget, man. But yeah. Okay. Let's continue. While Dubé's influence was generally limited to his native South Africa, James Aggrey, as an African exponent of the Tuskegee model, became almost as well known throughout the continent as Washington himself, especially in the British colonies. Indeed, if Dubé was the Booker T. Washington of South Africa, Aggrey, one writer has noted, was the Booker T. Washington of Africa. Aggrey arrived in the American South in 1898 and ended up spending 23 years there, first as a student and then as a teacher. He was the only black person to be appointed to the highly influential Phelps-Stokes Commissions on African Education of 1921 to 1922 and 1923 to 1924. As a member of those commissions, he traveled extensively, visiting virtually all of the British and a number of other European colonies. He subsequently returned to the Gold Coast to take up a position as assistant principal of Achimota College, the first secondary school in the colony. He died suddenly in 1927 during a visit to the United States. Maybe we have to look him up now. Maybe he was beaten to death. All right, or died from hypertension. Agre was a cultured black man of the type Washington took great delight in ridiculing. He believed firmly, like Washington himself, in the gospel of the plow for the masses, and he was strongly pro-colonial in his views. Pro-colonial. Indeed, just before his death, he was reportedly getting ready to write a defense of colonialism, especially British colonialism, to counter anti-colonial attack by Du Bois and other Pan-Africans. In his travels in Africa with the Phelps-Stokes Commissions, Agre had been highly critical of anti-colonial agitation, reserving particular condemnation for Garvey and his Universal Negro Improvement Association. Good to know. Right? Good to know. Which was then making considerable political inroads on the continent, especially in South Africa. So you see how Garvey's reach was, right? Well, they who preach Africa for the Africans, Garvey's most famous slogan, are mad. Agre told a predominantly black audience in Johannesburg, quote, "If you stood alone, you would soon be in deep darkness again." Using himself as a model product of Victorian Christian civilization, Agre declared that he was born a pagan and was not ashamed of it. However, quote, "If the missionaries had not sought and found me," he wrote, "I should today have perhaps a dozen wives. I should be making a beast of myself with palm wine. I should be a chief honored by my people. But I should know neither Shakespeare nor philosophy nor the gospel." Now he's like Mr. Candace Owens, ain't he? God damn. Boy, it is. Oof. In the chat room, Kevin Care42 says, "One thing we can also learn from this, keep what you're doing secret. Do not let the enemy know what you're doing." That's the thing. That's the thing. There's a fine line that you have to draw between being bold and doing what you got to do and being sensible and not giving up too much information. And that can be a very fine line between those two things. On the one hand, you don't want to be so scared to proclaim your actions, right? To proclaim what you're doing, right? Because you do need to invest time and energies in recruiting people and stuff. So there has to be some word out there, right? But you don't want to give details on exactly what you're doing. When you give the details, people can destroy you. See Umar Johnson, right? Yeah, so that's the thing. KW Don 7 says R.R. Moton was an agent sent in to spy on Washington and worked against Marcus Garvey and complicit in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. You see, that's good information, right? That's good information. That's information I have to flesh out about R.R. Moton going forward. Thanks for that. See, that's why I like the chat room. The chat room is going to drop some knowledge in there that goes with whatever it is we're reading. That's what we want. All right, I appreciate you guys. All right. After Agre's death, the well-known British missionary scholar Edwin W. Smith published a highly sympathetic biography of him, which bore an appropriately Bookerite title, Agre of Africa, a study in black and white provides a laudatory outline of Agre's Tuskegee-oriented pro-colonial political views and soon became required reading in many schools in the English-speaking colonies. I could see why. Abbreviated versions of it also were published and widely distributed, many of them by the British Colonial Office. Let me pause here for quick station IDs, take a sip of water, etc., etc. You know the deal. I'll be right back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Make sure to check out those shows on KWAZ Radio. Speaking of that, I was watching The Warship the other day, and I saw KW Don 7 in the chat room there as well. So KW Don 7 is a model listener. He's checking out different shows, KWAZ Radio, and I appreciate him for all that he does. And in the chat room, James Mensa, I think I've seen James Mensa here before, but it's been a long time, asks a question: why do they say that he is pre-colonial and W.E.B. Du Bois is anti-colonial? Who do you mean when you ask that question? Talking about Booker T. Washington? And do you mean pro-colonial? Do you mean that this guy, or are you talking about this guy we just talked about, the old-time Mr. Candace Owens here, Dr. Agre, right? He was pro-colonial. I don't know if that's what you mean, but pro-colonial meaning that he was good with colonialism. Du Bois and them was anti-colonialism, right? Kevin Carefoy too says Khrushchev, before he took power during the Soviet era, was always looked at as a joker. No one took him serious, but he was serious about getting power. Yeah, you have to move certain ways sometimes, right? But you have to be very serious underneath it all, right? To continue. Known university as Dr. Agre, the Conservative Pan-Africanist became a household name in Africa and was cited as an authority on subjects ranging from race relations to temperance, child rearing, and education, including education for women. Prominent Africans have vivid memories of their encounters with Agre and his work. By the way, if R.R. Moton was a spy and sellout and all that, what is this paper really defending here? Because this guy Agre doesn't sound much better. Lawrence Vambi, who in the post-World War II era became a leading journalist in southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, recalls that during the 1930s, Agre's biography was read in, quote, almost every African school in that colony. It was, he said, treated as a thriller. Mbuyi Konange's father, after meeting Agre in 1924, determined that his son should become an educated man like Agre and sent the boy to Hampton Institute. The younger Koinange went on to become a leading figure in the Kenyan nationalist movement, and after independence in 1963 was rewarded with a variety of official appointments. Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria credits Agre with transforming his life. He describes how, as a 16-year-old schoolboy, he was, quote, spiritually electrified by an address by Agre. The message conveyed in this address, quote, struck my soul with the force of a supernatural wand. The scales fell from my eyes, and I began to see a glorious future. All of this is very Christian talk, by the way. The scales fell from my eyes. Thus inspired, Azikiwe followed in the footsteps of his mentor. After obtaining an education in the United States, where he attended Lincoln and Howard universities, among other places, Azikiwe returned home to play a major role in the anti-colonial struggle. He eventually emerged as the first governor general, later president, of Nigeria. You see, right here is where we have to have that little discussion. The discussion being that from whom you get your education is probably, it might be even more important as to what your education is, right? From whom you get your education is super important. If you get your education from Thomas Sowell, right, Larry Elder, Candace Owens and all this old stuff, you will be a race trader by grade 6. Right? You will be a race trader by grade 6. It's important that when you're talking about curriculum and stuff, and this is why we got to get away from the religious instruction. We just about blackness, black exceptionalism, black pride, right? Get the homosexual, the homosexual talk out of our religion, out of our curriculum and all that type of stuff. Right? We just got to get right to what it needs to be about solving our problems, being able to fix our situation, being able to have the power to do it on our own. You see, this is what we got to get rid of. Right? So even though Booker T might, even though Booker T was well-meaning in his work, there's certain things that come up even with Booker T, and you see it with these guys that we're talking about in this paper. This idea of, ignore the hate that's being directed towards you. That's Booker T has this book on, what's the term? I talked about it earlier this episode too. On, damn, I forgot the term. On character building, right? The truth is, one of the things about Booker T and them and their character building, it's kind of like on that turn the other cheek type thing. Don't worry about the racist. Don't worry about the hate. They lynching folks, I get it, but at the end of the day, you have to, you have to go high when they go low. It's that type of shit. And we got to be very clear that we don't want that even in terms of when we're talking curriculum. We want a curriculum that's about the power, right, to handle your business, even in the case if someone does something to you. The power to fix your own problems, right? That's what we need. We need teachers. As I talked about in a previous paper, the Afrocentric profile of a teacher. Go and check out that episode. It's a good read. We need those Afrocentric type of teachers who are fully immersed and prepared to undertake the task of getting children, right, to proceed through this educational rite of passage to being able to take care of the society in the future. To continue, it bears emphasizing, however, that the Tuskegee model did not mean the same thing to all members of the emergent African elite. In Southern Rhodesia, for instance, it was the idea of self-help, that is, independent, African-controlled schools and black-run business ventures, right? Not industrial education or the Tuskegee political style that aspiring middle-class Africans found most attractive in the Tuskegee model. Thus, in 1929, when a group of Africans in the colony floated the idea of establishing a school that would be free of white missionary control, it was Tuskegee to which they naturally turned. Quote, we read what Booker Washington did in America, they said. Quote, if Booker Washington could erect a school, why not us too if we want it? So we want the government to allow us to do as the Negroes, that is the Black Americans did. And that's the thing, you have to want it. As I said here before in the past, if you believe in this stuff, you got to put your effort, you got to put your money, etc. behind it, right? Over the next 30 years, Africans in Southern Rhodesia attempted to put into effect a number of other educational schemes, only one of which achieved any degree of success. Significantly, this one successful scheme was, according to Stan Lake, Sam Kange, its chief organizer. Let me highlight that. Quote, an African college on the lines of the Tuskegee Institute. And in their quest to establish independent educational institutions, Africans in Southern Rhodesia and other parts of Southern Africa continued to appeal to the African American, particularly to the Tuskegee example. Quote, if our brothers and sisters who were slaves in America with nothing they could call their own could build the famous Tuskegee College out of a chicken house, the secretary of a school building scheme from Nyasaland told his countrymen working in Southern Rhodesia in 1955. I see no reason why we, if we are really determined and are prepared to sacrifice and to help ourselves, should not build a Nyasa college for an educationally hungry Nyasa land. Listen, he's exactly right. If Booker T and them, remember Booker T was born into slavery a few years before emancipation. If Booker and if Booker T could design and build a school in that time, in 1881, right? As a young man, right? There's no reason why we can't do the same today. We are playing ourselves. We're talking about freedoms and power and all this type of stuff, but we're not doing the work for freedom and power. We need more folks doing the work. What most of these individuals citing examples of Black American success stories fail to realize, of course, is that Tuskegee and other Black-run and oriented educational institutions were built and operated largely on white money. That's what you don't want. Remember, it was one of those presidents who liked Booker T a lot and gave Booker T money. In fact, when he gave Booker T the money, was it Coolidge or one of them? When he gave Booker T the money, Booker T decided that he will only pay himself, I think, $1 a year or something like that from the school itself. Was it because of the money he got from that president? Am I accurate in what I'm saying? I think I might have something twisted around, but I think I'm mostly accurate in what I'm saying. Right? In Africa, this source of funding was not available, at least not to the same extent as in the United States, and that's why we gotta fund this. Put your money up. In the chat room, Kevin Care42 says the key word is sacrifice. Exactly. Also secrecy. Teach and build in secret, and play up the enemy's ego. Build up the enemy's ego and bring it crashing down. Right? We gotta sacrifice. We don't want to be funded. Whoever funds you controls you. You understand? You don't want that. Similarly, the Tuskegee model had a pronounced impact on the economic ideas espoused by members of the emergent African middle class. Southern Rhodesia, for example, Washington's concept of racial economic nationalism, that is, the notion that Black people should first seek economic power as the basis for obtaining political and social rights, permeated the propaganda campaign that was mounted in the 1930s to popularize the idea of African-operated cooperative business ventures. Especially interesting in this connection was the emphasis placed on the close relationship between black economic success and earning the respect of white people. See, we don't care about the respect of white folks, which admittedly Booker was on some of that type of stuff, right? Writing in 1937, one booster of African cooperative capitalism argued, quote, "If we go back to the history of all races in the world, we find that there is no race that can be recognized without developing itself upon the lines of wealth. Race that is poor, its voice will not be heard by other races who have developed their progress upon the lines of wealth. What is needed in the world today is that the African races should come together. We do seek in every possible way to eliminate the name boy and substitute the name man. That will be done only by cooperating on a continental and industrial basis." I love that. I love that. That goes to what I talked about at the start of the year. Let's talk more abundance. Right? Let's start working together to bring each other up economically. Right? And bring our whole group up as one. Washington, in his Atlanta Compromise speech, had argued along the same lines. Quote, "No race that has anything to contribute to the markets of the world is long in any degree ostracized." He noted. In effect, Washington and his followers were arguing that black capitalism would solve the race problem. Up to the 1930s, that philosophy was a major theme in Pan-African economic thought. Yeah, during the 50s and stuff like that, or maybe even earlier, like they're saying the 30s, the idea of socialism entered the African people's minds. And when I say African people, again, I'm talking about all of us inside and outside the continent. Right? This idea that socialism, right, Marxism, will defeat capitalism. Nah, you gotta compete. You gotta compete better. The game is the game. This is the game that the world is on now. You have to compete in that game. You can't run away with it with so-called European alternatives. The game is what it is. Do you have to exploit people and put profits over people? Hell no. But you got to be somewhat better at the game. Stop being afraid to compete in the game. If one of the whole Africans found the Tuskegee Model of Development attractive because of its perceived advocacy of independent schools and black capitalism, it was the emphasis on industrial education and acceptance of the existing political order that caught the attention of the various white agencies of imperialism. Colonial officials, missionaries, and various self-styled experts on African education, many of them Americans, ultimately played a more significant role than anyone else in introducing the Tuskegee model into Africa. In 1903, for example, Southern Rhodesian authorities invited Washington to pay an extended visit to the colony in order to report on the best methods to raise, educate, and civilize Africans. Washington considered the invitation seriously, but after conferring with a number of people, including President Theodore Roosevelt, he finally declined. Maybe it was Roosevelt I was thinking about, right? He finally declined. While unable to persuade the doyen of industrial education to visit the colony to devise a scheme for them, the Southern Rhodesian authorities were sure that Tuskegee provided the model for the kind of training that their Africans should receive, In a colony dominated by white settlers, where the, quote, native labor question, end of quote, stood at the core of public policy, the authorities took a decidedly hostile view of literary education. One native commissioner commented in 1905, quote, that a letter education does not add to the industry of the native, nor does it make him any more useful than the ordinary good work boy. The majority of educated natives I have met have usually turned out to be idle and in a great measure dishonest. I don't think the state should support native education beyond what is required to make him a good workman. He should not be educated until he fancies himself a fine gentleman, too good to undertake ordinary work. All right. To guard against this possibility and help to ensure a steady supply of good work boys, the government in the early 1920s established 2 Tuskegee-type industrial schools. Furthermore, the authorities, using the leverage provided by state supervision and the limited official financial support given to the mission schools, brought about a general reorientation of African education. Henceforth, much greater emphasis was placed on industrial training than had therefore been the case. Indeed, so thoroughly did the mission schools in southern Rhodesia come to accept the Tuskegee model that as late as the post-World War II era, a prominent member of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, one of the leading missionary societies in the colony, was still returning to the source for inspiration. A tour of Tuskegee and other industrial schools in the South was desirable. The Reverend Frank Meacham informed his headquarters in Boston in late 1946 as, quote, "This should give me a good insight into community and cooperation work that is being done in the Negro communities of the South and help me in some of the problems we are facing in Africa." In other parts of Africa, there was a parallel movement in the interwar years toward redirecting the educational system along industrial lines. This is not to suggest, of course, that the mission schools up to this point had neglected industrial training. On the contrary, vocational education had been an integral part of the missionary enterprise from the outset. What was new, rather, was the attempt, especially in the interwar years, to place industrial training at the center of the curriculum and to provide only as much literary education as would facilitate the production of more effective laborers. So when we talk about today, when I talk about curriculum, African-centered, and that we want to look at what Booker T did, the reason why I look to Booker T and the industrial education is because a lot of Africa's problems, a lot of black people's, wherever you are, problems is the fact that we don't control and we don't have an infrastructure. So when there's a problem, right, we got to rely on others to come and fix those problems. Africa's main problem is that you don't have the workers with the education, right, to solve those problems. And of course, they have a power problem with these other people middling in their business, right? We have to have the people who are focused on solutions, African solutions for African problems. And I think Booker T's curriculum was focused on black people's solutions for black people problems. And I think it's something that we can introduce, a similar updated curriculum can be introduced to people wherever there's African communities. It's not about creating a workforce for people to go look for a job from white folks. It's about people who are able to go back to the continent or maybe even the Caribbean or what have you, right? And build the continent and its satellite countries, right, into a powerhouse. That's what it's about. It's about you being in America. Let's say you're from America, or let's say you're from the Caribbean, or let's say you're from the UK, and you have the know-how and knowledge that you could go back to whatever country it is in the continent and say, look, I'm here. I have the ability to do this. I can help you fix this. I can rally the people to produce solutions, right? That's what it's about. In the chat room, Kevin Kerr says, forget their isms. We have to build with our own ideas. NYC Beauties, again, check out NYC Beauties on YouTube. We are a great and intelligent people We don't need permission to build and be free. Exactly. We have to understand that, though. Our people have to understand that, and certain work has to be laid down, unfortunately, to get our people on the right path. Okay. To continue, we're almost done here. Working in tandem with colonial administrators and missionaries to introduce Tuskegee-type industrial education into Africa were a number of outside foundations and individuals. Reference has already been made to the two Phelps-Stokes Fund Commissions on African Education. In this regard, special mention must be made of Thomas Jesse Jones, the fund's expert on Black American and African education, who chaired and wrote the reports of both commissions. These reports, in fact, provided the intellectual basis for the emphasis colonial administrators came to place on industrial education in the 1920s and 1930s. Mention must be made, too, of the British missionary statesman J.H. Ullman. Backed by Jones and the Phelps-Stokes Fund, Ullman sponsored a number of meetings that were aimed at promoting industrial education in Africa, the first of which was the World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh in 1910. Indeed, Ullman, who went on to become the Secretary of Internal Missionary Council, the coordinating body of the major British Protestant denominations, and the first editor of its organ, the International Review of Missions, plays a crucial role in the issuance of the British government's Imperial Memorandum on African Education in 1925. Man, it kills me to read about the British, having to say anything about African education, right? But that's what happens when you get colonized. Entitled Education Policy in British Tropical Africa, this memorandum sought to provide broad guidelines for colonial authorities on the development of educational policies. The Tuskegee influence on the memorandum, the first draft of which was authored by Ullman, can be seen in the heavy emphasis on vocational education. Quote, it should be the aim of the educational system to instill into pupils the view that vocational, especially industrial and manual careers, are not less honorable than the clerical. It stated it should also be the policy of government to make industrial careers, quote, at least as attractive, end of quote, as white-collar ones, and thus to counteract the tendency to look down on manual labor. The various white agents of imperialism, including Jones, Ullman, and the Colonial Office, hoped that an industrial, as opposed to a literary education, besides having a utilitarian value in an underdeveloped colonial economy, would provide an antidote to colonial nationalism. Jones, for example, believed that there was a direct relationship between an exaggerated emphasis on liberal education and anti-colonial agitation in India. You see, that's why they were pushing it. This is not why we're pushing it, right? And warned that this mistake should be avoided in Africa. And this is why you don't need no white hand to hold yours to do what you got to do. You just have to do what you got to do. Quote, Indian leaders of thought, he noted in the report of the first Phelps-Stokes Commission, have recently charged much of the unrest in India to the fact that the schools have too exclusively prepared the young Indians for literary and clerical occupations, to the neglect of the activities that are more fundamental in the economic and social development of their great country. It should thus come as no surprise, given the pervasiveness of the belief about the appropriateness of industrial education for blacks, that Africans coming to the United States in search of education were steered by Phelps, Stokes, and other sponsors to Tuskegee and other industrial-oriented, politically safe schools in the South. Of all the colonial authorities in Africa, none showed greater enthusiasm for the Tuskegee model than the South Africans, of course. The most enthusiastic support of the Tuskegee model within South African officialdom was Charles T. Loram, the country's leading white authority on the quote-unquote the native question, and a man who had held many governmental positions, including that of Chief Inspector of Native Education for the province of Natal. In his attempt to create for Black South Africans an educational system on the Tuskegee model, and with it, the corresponding political and social values, Loram was strongly supported by the Phelps-Stokes Fund and the Carnegie Corporation, which financed many of his activities, including personal travels to the United States. Loram also became a member of the Second Phelps-Stokes Commission on African Education. He corresponded with Washington and had done research at Tuskegee and a number of other Southern industrial schools for his Columbia University dissertation. Published later under the title The Education of the South African Native, this book is an elaboration of Loram's long-held thesis concerning the applicability in South Africa of American-style industrial education. By the late 1920s, however, Loram found himself increasingly under attack from within the state apparatus. The South African government by this time had come under the firm control of predominantly Afrikaans, right? Speaking xenophobic whites, whom Loram referred to as repressionists. Suspicious of Loram's American connections and firmly opposed to the fervor with which he, a liberal by the standards that obtained in that era, approached the question of industrial education for Africans, the repressionists eventually forced him out of his official positions. Taken to its logical extreme, the antipathy with which most white settlers in Southern Africa viewed educated Africans, the repressionists saw little need to make provisions for African education, industrial or otherwise. Disillusioned by this turn of events, Loram abandoned South Africa for the United States, became a professor at Yale University specializing in industrial education for Africans. Before the rise of the repressionists, the Tuskegee model had attracted enthusiastic support from South African officials, and the reason is not far to seek. Faced with a majority black population that was indispensable to the functioning of the mineral-based, labor-intensive economy, a population that they were also determined to repress politically and socially, many white South Africans in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries saw in Southern American Jim Crow a model of how to manage the natives. Black South Africans, too, saw many similarities between their plight and that of African Americans, which partially explains the attractiveness of the Tuskegee model to individuals such as Dube and Sol Plaatje, Dube's political ally and fellow admirer of Washington. They, like Washington and his allies in the United States, sought to work within the limits of what was deemed politically possible. With that end in view, the Tuskegee Model of Development, with its emphasis on work over agitation, business over politics, and industrial training over literary education, was embraced with varying degrees of zealousness as providing a compromise formula for black survival in a white-dominated and largely hostile world. In sum, whether in Africa or the United States, the Tuskegee Model of Development did not challenge the political domination, economic subjugation, or cultural degradation of blacks attendant on colonialism and segregation and the entire superstructure of white supremacy that they upheld. Accommodationist in nature and aimed primarily at shoring up Southern American Jim Crow and minimizing resistance to it, the Tuskegee model had been designed for African Americans during a period appropriately referred to as the nadir of black history in the United States. It subsequently was vigorously promoted by American cultural expansionists, black and white alike, as well as by European imperialists as having relevance in Africa. Although it perpetuated an earlier tradition of African American influence in the ancestral homeland, the Tuskegee model is unique by virtue of the extent to which indigenous Africans, and more important, colonial administrators, missionaries, and secular experts participated in its introduction into Africa. Not all members of the educated African elite accepted the Tuskegee model in total. However, many of them welcomed what they believed to be its encouragement of black capitalism and black-run schools, but rejected altogether or simply ignored its counsel for acquiescence in the political realm. So that's the thing. That's the thing. You see, things are tools, right? Ideas, concepts, imagery, what have you. They're tools. And you can use them for good, like I always talk about. You can use them for bad. And what the repressionists, so to speak, were doing in Africa was in fact what Du Bois feared Booker T's work was going to do in America, right? Just create a class of black folks who are doing the work for white folks. But that's not what we're about, right? The problem at the time that this curriculum was implemented was Africa, right, was under colonial rule. They don't want to lose their stronghold on the continent, so whatever they give you in that respect, this is where they took Booker T's concept and turned it into a weapon against Africans. What I'm talking about is, and by the way, what I'm talking about is just as much literary as industrial education. I'm talking about a curriculum that's just as much literary as it is industrial. I'm talking about a curriculum that still will foster the imagination of youth to become doctors, to become engineers and lawyers and politicians and whatnot, but to use your talents for your people. You see what I'm saying? That's what I'm pushing for. I'm not pushing for creating a completely industrial education, right? And even if I was pushing for that, right, I'm definitely not pushing for it to be a thing where you go and get educated so then you could go work for these white groups, right, for these white folks. No. As far as the historiography of Pan-Africanism is concerned, a major reason for the lack of attention, according to the Tuskegee model, is that it simply does not conform to the standard conception of Pan-African movements. That's an interesting thing to say. Let me get my highlighter and highlight that. That's an interesting thing to say. Right? Does not conform to the standard conception Pan-African movements. Pan-Africanism is generally regarded as an inherently emancipatory force, indeed as the necessary culmination of the historic struggle for Africans and their descendants in the Americas against enslavement, colonialism, exploitation, and oppression. Viewed from this angle, Washington, Moton, Agri, Dewey, and other black proponents of the Tuskegee model, given their apparent willingness to compromise fundamental rights and to ingratiate themselves with the white ruling class, do indeed appear to be embarrassing aberrations. You see, this is why you got to use tools properly, right? This is why you have to use tools properly. If you have a hammer, like I always say, you can build a house with it, or you could bash someone's skull in. If the situation calls for you to bash someone's skull in, don't build a house. You see what I'm saying? If Pan-Africanism is what you say it is, right, this emancipatory force, right, which I agree it is, right, then use the curriculum, use the model for emancipation, not subservience, not, to ingratiate yourselves amongst white folks. Use it, right, to bring the race, to bring the people up. to continue. This is especially true when they are compared to individuals such as Du Bois, Edward Blyden, George Padmore, and other Pan-African icons. But if we accept what appears to be the standard definition of Pan-Africanism, that is, the interaction and interconnection, cultural, ideological, organizational, and personal, between what Garvey liked to call Africans at home and those abroad, then the Tuskegee model must be regarded as an expression of Pan-Africanism. Far from being a naturally progressive force, then, under certain circumstances, Pan-Africanism can become an instrument for affirming the subjugation and facilitating the oppression and exploitation of African peoples. It is to use, yeah, I get what they're saying there, I just don't like how it's said. It is, to use Franz Fanon's words, susceptible to the same pitfalls as all other forms of nationalism, pan or otherwise. And that's the paper, right? I get what they're saying here, right? If Pan-Africanism is a tool, you have to know when to use the tool, when and where to use the tool, right? Otherwise, you suffer the same failure as some of these other staunch, forms of nationalism, right? But again, if you have sense in your head, you can tell that the Tuskegee model works, but you have to direct its intentions, right? We're no longer trying to work ourselves into the white world and white respect. We're in a place now, we're trying to work ourselves into power. Again, I keep repeating it because it's so important. We're trying to find those black solutions for our black problems. And it's my contention that once we start to really roll with finding the solutions for our everyday problems, interacting with our environment better, right? And learning how to control the environment around us, right? All of this turncoat business about not being Africans, all that will stop, right? So we got to do the work. Those of us who are conscious, we got to be conscious about being conscious. We have to be conscious about doing conscious work and activities, and we got to make sure that we join in wherever there's endeavors going on that's only going to build power for us. We got to learn to get together and, more importantly, get it done. All right? Get together and, more importantly, get it done. As I'm saying that, I see KWAZ Radio is here. I want you guys to make sure you follow KWAZ Radio. Right now, KWAZ Radio has very small followers. I just recently passed 500 the other day. 500 subscribers. Make sure you subscribe to KWAZ Radio as well. There's some things that I want the show to do on that platform, but it's about time and stuff. So if you're a fan of the show and you want to help the show do better, let me know. Hop on the Discord that you see just posted in the chat room. Hop on the Discord, say, hey, I'm a fan of the show. What can I do to help the show? There's certain things I want to do with cutting up episodes into like quotable short passages and posting on KWAZ Radio, and I'd like to see the other shows on the platform do the same. And then those little snippets can be shared amongst your people on social media, right? If you think there's something that was particularly nicely said, or not, in this episode or on any of the episodes, hit me up in the comment section under the episode. Let me know the timestamps, and I'll look to cut those snippets out and I'll post it on KWAZ Radio so we can get more people on that channel and we can get more people aware of the work that's being done. Right? Is there any other questions or comments? I'll accept those. In the meantime, let me do a quick station ID break. And if there's anything to be discussed after, I'll discuss it when I come back.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
That's right. Check out those shows on KWAZ Radio as well as the Queen's Council podcast too. You know, like I say, man, NYC Beauties in the chat room said independence. 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 That's what we are working towards. And what you really want to do, is think about the future. Think about your children, your grandchildren, etc. Right? Think about yourself in your old age. What do you want to see for our people? And what you want to see is independence, it's progress, it's growth. What you want to see is less of us waiting around for white folks to help us. Right? That's you. That resonates with you, click the link in the chat room, join the Discord. You can help us with the curriculum, and or you can help us with the podcast to make the podcast bigger and better. In the chat room, NYC Beauty says this is the perfect time to build. Rona resetted everything. This really was the perfect time to build up stuff and prepare for the world to open up again when we're outside and we could meet up with people and do some things in the physical world. I don't only want to do stuff in the digital space, in the online internet space. I want to do things in the real world as well. But I don't mind starting with the digital right now. So join us on the Discord. I want to thank everyone who was here today. I know KW Don 7 graced us. Kevin Care 42 graced us. James Mensa graced us. NYC Beauties graced us. And if I missed anyone, I apologize. But until next time, this has been the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.